The Simpsons and Futurama contribute an immense amount to my enjoyment of cartoons, not just for their uniqueness, humour and style, but because these shows prove that animation is not just exclusively for children. Disenchantment is the third in Matt Groening's legacy of not-quite-for-children animated TV shows, and the first instalment, titled Part 1, was released on Netflix just a few days ago, consisting of 10 30-minute episodes. With high expectations, I spent 5 hours binging through this brand new series, and because there's basically bugger all else on at the moment, I thought I'd make a video giving you guys some insight as to whether or not this show is worth checking out. And honestly, I'm not sure it is. Here's why. After I'd finished watching the first episode, I summarised that 50% of the jokes were really funny, with the other 50% falling short of making me laugh at all. This unfortunately rang true for pretty much the entire series in general, but I would also be lying if I said the show overall wasn't funny. The animal jokes are really funny. The names of elves are used to great comedic effect. And various other moments made me LOL. As much as the show prides itself on being a Game of Thrones parody, I found some of the references quite funny, whilst not being overly dependent on them either. Disenchantment also parodies how desensitized audiences are to deaths in Game of Thrones. There are numerous times throughout the story where characters die for no apparent reason other than the plot requiring it for comedic effect. The only problem is that I think the show is a little late to the game when it comes to parodying Game of Thrones. Not only has Game of Thrones been a big joke from season 5 onwards, but Family Guy and South Park have already gone out of their way to parody this stuff before. Naturally, when I found out the Simpsons creator was jumping on the bandwagon too, I did produce a large sigh of disappointment. For clarity though, Disenchantment is more of a fantasy parody than anything else, in the same way that The Simpsons is a parody of wacky family sitcoms and Futurama is a parody of science fiction. One of the problems I think the show has with its comedy is what it chooses to show and what it doesn't. One example is in the first episode where the trio run into a forest where a sign says, "Beware of the racist antelope." This was funny because the sign isn't entirely obvious if you were following the character's movements across the screen. Later on though, the racist antelope actually shows up when they're all asleep, makes a comment, and then spits on the floor. This was, in my opinion, completely unnecessary because the anticipation of the absurd made it humorous. Another example occurs later in the series when the king asks for a glass of water. He's given one that's all grey and disgusting, and the bearer says it came from the well. The episode then cuts to an image of the well with a dead animal in it, and cuts back again to the king to carry on his dialogue. Like, what on earth was funny about that? Why did we even need to see it when the characters stand right in front of it later in the episode? The other problem with the comedy of Disenchantment is that it's far too dependent on familiarity. First of all, there is a huge dependence on making jokes about Scottish kilts. Not only is there a needlessly large amount of them throughout Part 1, but it surprised me that in a fantasy setting, there would even be Scotsmen around to make jokes about. Another example is in episode 7. Elfo, Bean's wimpy sidekick, dreams up a fantasy image of a giant lady in an attempt to deny his attraction to Bean. A giant woman of the description Elfo gives is dragged to Dreamland, where the pair are locked inside a room, presumably for sex. Does this remind anybody of a particular Futurama episode? Maybe this one?
Me want snoo.
Not only does it reference that particular episode, but the giant also has one eye. The trio give the giant a second eye to make her attractive enough to be Elfo's dance partner at a royal ball. Again, does this not ring more familiarity bells from the episode of Futurama where almost exactly the same thing happens to Leela? Fear not, however, this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the originality of this show. Which leads us nicely on to... You guys may have heard that Disenchantment is serialized, meaning that unlike The Simpsons and Futurama, the narrative has a beginning, middle, and end, instead of just resetting back to normal at the end of each episode. Executive producer and co-writer Josh Weinstein has claimed that Disenchantment was inspired by Alex Hirsch and his hit series Gravity Falls, which for those of you that haven't seen it is serialized from start to finish across 2 seasons. Now of course, if The Simpsons executives watching Gravity Falls didn't happened to be working on the same show for the past 30 years, maybe they would have noted just how thoroughly modern of a show Gravity Falls is. Not only did they know when to stop, but also allowed audiences to get more out of Gravity Falls beyond just watching it, like using ciphers and codes that were integrated with the show's website and social media pages. The modern internet-savvy audiences want more out of their shows than simply watching it, such as talking about it in the digital space, and this interactivity is partially why Gravity Falls became so successful in the first place. In Disenchantment, there's nothing like this to be found, just this little Easter egg. By making the show more serialized, this gives way to arcs in the story that last throughout. There are two fairly obvious ones in Disenchantment, the first of which is the Elixir of Life, the only real exploration of which begins in episode 8, and the other is relating to Lucy, the demon cat thing that completes the protagonist trio. Whilst causing chaos in Dreamland, he is observed by 3 other characters far away. The sad thing is that we never learn much about Lucy as a character, about his co-conspirators, or anything of that like, which kind of leaves him as this sort of extension of Bean's rebellious psyche. Now, I'm aware that more episodes are to come, so undoubtedly he will be, well, hopefully more fleshed out at some point, but it makes his character a little unnecessary in part 1. Bean has enough reason to be a drunken rebel of the royal family on her own without him. Speaking of which, it's a massive shame that a large portion of the episodes focus solely on the trio getting drunk and or high. This doesn't necessarily mean that characters in TV shows or films shouldn't get intoxicated for comedic reasons. Homer Simpson is notorious for getting drunk, but that was just a side effect of him being a lousy father. In Disenchantment, they get drunk almost as though it's justified in some way. It happens so often that, at the very beginning of half of the episodes in part 1, Bean's first appearance in them is either in the pub or out drinking. The 2 episodes where the trio gets quote-unquote high really miss the marker compared to other shows that try to tackle drugs thematically. Let's compare the episode Love's Tender Rampage with another animated Netflix original, BoJack Horseman. In BoJack, the titular character tries to write his autobiography with the help of his friends and a lot of hard drugs. Not only is the level of detail in this trip absolutely astounding to the eyes, but also serves a narrative purpose too, as BoJack comes out of the trip realizing that he still has time to be a good and memorable person without having to write a book about it. In Disenchantment, they only get high because Bean merely wanted to try it out. Hashtag YOLO, I guess. With the promise of a continuous story, audience members will pay closer attention to details in the story in case they play an important role later in the plot. However, there are some elements in the story that are shown time and time again without any real payoff or humour. Take the Plague Patrol, for example. In episode 1, the man and cart are briefly shown, leading me initially to think that this was just a nod to Monty Python's Holy Grail.
Bring out your dead!
But in episode 3, it shows up again to add to the continuous ha 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 drunken banter of the trio, and shows up again in episode 7 for the sole purpose of showing where all the bodies go, inspiring Bean to get high. The weirdest thing about this show, though, is that despite most of it doesn't feel particularly well structured, the final 3 episodes shine not only because they're the funniest, but because they were exactly what I wanted out of a fantasy parody by the creators of The Simpsons. Episode 8 is probably the best of them all because it actually feels like an adventure to get some treasure instead of Bean just getting drunk and being useless. It not only felt like there was some progression to her character, but also left me with an eagerness to find out what was going to happen in the next episode. The same can pretty much be said for episode 9 too, as we return to Elfland to explore that mysterious part of the world they briefly touched on in episode 1. Then by the end of that episode, Bean has to make a choice whether to reincarnate her dead for 15 years mother, or Elfo, her friend who dies just beforehand. She gives into her emotions and revives her mother, which works thematically as episode 10 explores how her choice might not have been the best idea, like how the king can't rule with 2 wives, and how her mum turns out to be also a drunk and happens to be a little bit wicked too. As much as all this praise comes at the end, it only does so because of how much waffle you have to get through in order to appreciate the last 3 episodes. Whilst I'm talking positively about the show, I'll say that the King, played by John DiMaggio, is probably my favourite of the bunch. Not only is he a perfect fit for the role, but because his character is fairly central to the Elixir of Life story arc, he ends up becoming one of the main characters. There was also a really nice inclusion of Noel Fielding in one episode as the Executioner. The exclusivity of his role made episode 5 one of the more memorable episodes of the series. As for the rest of them, however, I was slightly disappointed because, as mentioned previously, there are only 10 30-minute episodes. This means there isn't a lot of time to flesh out side characters, and as a result of serializing the plot, the main protagonist is given development priority. If we examine Bean's stepmother, Queen Una, and her half-brother Prince Derek, we find that they have barely any development at all. Even Elfo and Lucy, Bean's sidekicks, aren't exactly the most interesting of characters, as they just seem to be going along for the ride and free booze. By episode 6, the trio travel with the royal family to Dankmire, the homeland of Queen Una. The focus is completely stripped away from exploring new territory, and instead tries to once again give Bean the spotlight by making her the ambassador of Dreamland, tasked with writing a speech. You can already guess what she does instead, can't you? Yeah, she gets drunk and fucks it all up. To add insult to injury though, as soon as the Dankmire people declare war on Dreamland, she just sobers up in an instant and escapes. Not only does Dreamland not face any further backlash from Dankmire in the subsequent episodes, but Queen Una is completely unfazed by the events that have just transpired for the rest of part 1. So much for the serialized narrative, I guess. Given that Netflix, arguably the biggest distributor of online TV and films, commissioned this show, I was surprised at how basic and clunky the animation of this show was. You may have to take my critique in this final section with a pinch of salt though, as I lack the experience and knowledge of a true animator, and I can only imagine it must take the patience of a god to create something as sophisticated as this. But just comparing it with Groening's previous work, and even the world of animation in general, I felt that the style of Disenchantment was quite underwhelming. If we look at the opening titles, we see that all of the episodes begin with aesthetically altered stills of scenes to come in the episode with silhouetted characters. Despite this meaning that each intro is slightly different, they feel so lazily conjured and prevents me from being surprised in any way when I watch the episode itself. We can look at the first episode as a perfect example of the 2D animation being quite lackluster, particularly in action scenes. Our first scene in the series with Bean shows her getting out of a bar brawl. It honestly felt like they had to rush to cram a lot into the pilot, that the scene itself was almost forgotten about in seconds. Even the brief gnome war that we see soon afterwards felt quite weak, and when you want to wow audiences over with your first episode, I would have thought that there would be a level of improvement over previous work required to hook audiences into watching more than one episode. It probably doesn't help that the first episode is nearly 10 minutes longer than the rest, but even with the cramming, I don't understand why this episode was longer than the rest. Another reason this may have been the case is the huge gap in Groening's projects. There was only 10 years apart from the first seasons of The Simpsons and Futurama, whereas there has been nearly 20 years between the start of Futurama and Disenchantment. The CGI segments in Disenchantment not only feel outdated, but perhaps the mix between 2D and 3D animation is something that the animators haven't quite caught up with yet. Whenever we see these big swooping shots of Dreamland, I can't help but be reminded of something like Treasure Planet, where the awkward combination of hand-drawn and computer-generated animation feels very disjointed. This becomes particularly apparent in the final episode, where one particular segment jumps back and forth between 2D and 3D in a crazy fashion, taking me completely out of the story. Take a look. With the demand for adult cartoons being higher than ever before, it's understandable why Groening would want to cash in at this time to finish off his life's work with this show. There are a lot of factors that have put pressure on the guy to make this show, so it's understandable why Disenchantment might have been so disappointing. Groening has had to work on The Simpsons for nearly 30 years now, so his creativity levels may have stagnated somewhat. With respect to his age, as well as the recent controversy over the character Apu by moralizing busybodies, perhaps the decision to act now in case Fox suddenly pull The Simpsons is justified. Despite my reluctance to say this, perhaps the best thing to do would be to end The Simpsons. After all, it's beaten the record for longest running sitcom now, and quite frankly, who watches it anymore? If Disenchantment was perhaps more of a priority on Groening's schedule, this could give way to part 2, or even a season 2 or whatever, being an improvement on what we've seen already. After all, it did take The Simpsons a little bit of time to get the ball truly rolling. Maybe some patience is all that's required with this show. We'll just have to wait and see. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more future videos from moi. Join us in the Discord server if you want to carry on these discussions. We talk about Doctor Who, we talk about Black Mirror, we talk about all kinds of things. But you know, just check it out if you feel that way inclined.